Welcome everyone. Today's topic is going to be on inspecting dead outs. I am almost 100% certain that every beekeeper who has had a colony has experienced a dead out from overwintering in Alberta. It is unfortunately an expectation with our harsher climate. However, some causes of dead out mortality can be avoided. And today we're going to go through different reasons that could cause it, how you can avoid it in the future if possible, and even if it's disease. So today we luckily have an expert on this. It was not Dr. Renata Labuskag. Unfortunately, she could not attend today. So in her stead, we have the fantastic Ali Panasiuk. She is Alberta's lead inspector for the Bee Health Assurance team, and as of today, I believe, acting provincial apiculturist. So I'll hand it over to her.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I'm happy to be here on short notice. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Um, do, do, do. Okay, let me know when you can see that.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. All right, so today we're going to talk about why dead out forensics matter. So overwinter losses are expected, but many causes can be preventable. And there's two key points I just want to elaborate on. There may be more than one cause of death in your colony, and you may not know why the colonies have died. So you can go through this whole process and there still might not be an answer, but at least you'll know whether you should reuse the combs or not. So also a good diagnosis improves next season's management. It reduces disease spread when reusing equipment, and it can help prioritize fixes. So your nutrition, mites, queens, moisture, and comb health. So before I go into the field, I'm going to get my kit with all my supplies ready. So one of my favorites is toothpicks and a flashlight. So I'm able to get into those brood cappings with a toothpick and then my flashlight. Some of the comb is really dark, so it can be hard to see inside those cells. Also, nitrile gloves or latex gloves are really good just in case there's a pathogen that can be spread, or say mice. You're protected. A notebook or your smartphone is always good so you can document what you see in the field. Garbage bags are handy in case you want to take the whole frames back for analysis. Specimen containers. So whether you want to sample varroa mites for amitraz resistance per se, you can get that in the field right away. Or dead adult bees, you can send off for various different analyses for, say, viruses, nosema, etc. So having all of this on hand before you go to the apiary is really helpful. So when you're first arriving in the apiary, you're going to observe what you see outside. You're going to then open your colonies, potentially sample. You're going to then interpret your observations and sample results, and then act accordingly. So by identifying the reason for your overwintering losses, you can adapt your management practices to reduce losses in the future and prevent the spread of disease from infected equipment. Okay, so first you're going to look outside. You're going to check the entrances. Look for external piles of dead bees. So large piles of dead bees outside of the colony, and where they look like they're in somewhat of the same condition, is an acute event clue. And that often coincides with varroa and viruses and potentially pesticides. So if you want to send a sample away for pesticide analysis, there's going to be some questions you'll be asked. So do you know what spray was conducted in the area and what crops? And are you in contact with the farmer? So if just keeping in mind that you will be asked these questions when submitting a sample for pesticide kill. When you start to see large external bee piles of dead bees, start considering potential reporting and collecting these dead bees for pathogen and pesticide residue analysis. Another thing to keep in mind that this may indicate that the death occurred in the fall or early winter rather than in the middle of the winter. So these are all key things to kind of document. And field signs are not definitive as many stressors look similar. Okay, another thing you can observe outside is dysentery. So whether on the side of the colony or the winter wrap, and keep in mind that feces on the side of the colony can be caused by various issues. So historically, Nosema apis, either off-spec bad sugar syrup feed, and potentially chemical treatment side effects. Okay, next you're gonna then open the colony. You're gonna locate the cluster and then start pulling frames out. But first, where's the cluster located? Where are the bees? Is it a tight cluster? If that's the case, it most likely died during the winter, in the cold winter months, because that cluster is super tight. If the bees are kind of scattered and the cluster is a bit all over the place, that's a good indication that it happened in the fall or most likely spring. Or it could have happened during an extreme duration of, warm weather, causing the cluster to disperse, and then a cold snap could have hit and killed them. And then I also like to look at the condition of the bees themselves. So if it's a recent death, the bees are going to be intact. They're going to be fresh looking on the frames and bottom board. If they're dry, moldy bees that are not intact, so kind of in pieces, heads are over here, thorax, etc., or a strong odor from decomposition, it likely happened late fall, early winter. And here are some photos. So lots of dead bees on a bottom board. I'm looking at the cluster here. It could have been dropped down from the top box as well, keeping in mind. And here's some very fresh dead bees on a bottom board. They almost look as if they could just fly away. So this is something I would make note of, that it happened suddenly and recently. Okay, and now I'm going to start pulling frames out. I'm going to see if there's chilled brood. So chilled brood, there's going to be dead, darkened larvae across various stages, and it's going to be often towards the brood edges, and the cappings may also look wet. So yeah, this can happen after severe temperature swings occur. And also keeping in mind that thermal regulation stress can be due to pathogens as well. Yeah, so it's quite clear that the outside edges are dying, and this is an indicator of chilled brood. Okay, signs of starvation include empty frames with no honey, bee butts sticking out of cells. So this photo, you can see lots of bee butts. There can be a tight cluster of bees located away from the honey. So if warm weather occurred in the winter, that cluster could move to a new location where feed is. They can eat all that feed. You get a cold snap, and if the cluster's too small, it won't be able to move back to or move to a new location where the honey is located. And there could also be a small patch of brood located under the cluster. So unfortunately, starvation is one of the leading causes of winter colony losses, and it is largely preventable. So colonies must have enough honey pollen stores going into winter, and the sugar syrup feed ratio is 2 to 1. So, and a good rule of thumb is if you can't tip the colony in the fall, so taking the bottom board and tipping it, it's likely okay and it has enough food stores for the winter. Okay, ventilation. I've seen this a few times, and basically the reason why this occurs is because there isn't enough ventilation with a top entrance and a bottom entrance, and what can happen is if the bottom board is also not slightly tilted for moisture to come out, it can pool. Some beekeepers also drill a small hole, and sometimes the bees can fill that with propolis. They love to do that, but at least there's a potential for water or moisture to come out. So yeah, signs of moisture include visible moisture on inner covers, walls, and frames, water pooling on bottom boards, a moldy cluster of bees near the top bars or on the frames suggests persistent dampness, and your adult bees will look wet, like in this photo. Yeah, so your ventilation and wrap choices can trap humidity, so it's really important to have that top hole and bottom hole for the airflow. All right, we'll move on to queen failure. There can be some signs of queen failure, so having a small cluster, but keep in mind that could be due to other issues or pathogens. No brood signs when you'd expect the spring to build up. Drone comb near the cluster. So this is a good example of a droned layer. So she's laying unfertilized eggs. There can also be signs consistent with laying workers. So you can see multiple eggs in a cell. And again, this is where a flashlight works really well to get in there. You can still see eggs in cells weeks, sometimes a couple months later. And then another sign is old queen cells on the brood frames. And so we call those supersedure cells. All right, and lastly, when you're opening rodents, rodents can be a problem. Signs are chewed comb in the bottom corners, nest material in the bottom boxes. Bees' heads on the bottom board you can see are removed, and those critters are eating the muscle, and in the thorax, it's high in protein. So you can see in this photo there. And I really liked this photo of a little mouse bomb I found on my computer. It's amazing how many photos I've taken across the years and digging them up. Okay, so one thing also to keep in mind is that deer mice can carry hantavirus, so you want to make sure you're wearing your latex gloves. If there's not a lot of ventilation when you're cleaning up your dead oats, put a mask on and then remove the nest safely and prevent re-entry later on. So you can add reducers, mesh, close any big gaps. Yeah, and so strong colonies can fend off rodents, but the bees may be forced away from the stores where the winter cluster is then disrupted. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to sampling. So sampling dead bees and brood. First, we'll talk about nosema. So keeping in mind that symptoms can overlap with stress, so that can include from poor nutrition, long confinement, moisture, mites, viruses, etc. And these symptoms are slow spring buildup, signs of digestive stress. So dysentery can be from multiple causes, so avoid diagnosing your colony by saying my colony has nosema by looking at the poop on the side of the hive. For treatment, Fumagillin B is the registered antibiotic, or there are other natural prebiotics that may be used during spring-fall feeding. Make sure you follow the product labeled directions. And I've had some beekeepers ask me about acetic acid fumigation, and there is strong data that it works with Nosema apis, that species, but Alberta predominantly has Nosema ceranae. The best recommendation is to cull your comb. So if you get samples back with high levels and the comb looks old, just cull them, destroy them, add in some nice fresh frames. Okay, so again, as mentioned, the field diagnosis is suggestive only, so the confirmation requires lab testing of adult bees. So this is determined by a microscope, and you're looking for spores. So the threshold is greater than 1 million spores per bee. So when you're sampling for nosema in the colony, you want adult bees that can be collected from clusters on frames or the bottom boards. And you want to make sure they're more intact, because the more intact they are, the better nosema can be detected. Fecal matter can also be tested on the front of the hive, but it will just give you a positive or negative. It's not going to tell you if the infestation is high in the colony on the bees. Okay, now we're going to switch gears to Varroa and viruses. So I have to say almost 95% of winter loss dead out inspections I go to is due to Varroa and viruses because they are so hard to treat right now with the current treatment and miticides on the market. So I'm going to show some photos of some really good signs that they were killed by Varroa and viruses. Okay, so number one, you can see mites on bottom boards. But again, keep in mind that this can be due to the treatment knockdown and not necessarily the infestation in the colony when they died. But it can be a good indicator if the colony has viruses in the background. So when there's a virus-associated collapse, there's going to be few bees left in the colony, and even dead bees. There's not going to be a lot because they absconded, likely absconded in the fall, where they're all outside of the colony. There's going to be lots of honey in the colony with not a lot of brood. And the confirmation requires lab testing of adult bees. And keeping in mind that it may not be super accurate because of virus degradation. So again, you want to sample more intact bees, but you can get the debris on the bottom and send that away for analysis. For mites on bottom boards, you can also collect those and get them tested for amitraz resistance if that is of interest. If there are dead bees on the frames, you can still do an alcohol shake. It may not be as accurate as, well, obviously when they're alive, but it can still give you a good indication of how many mites are on the dead bees in the cluster. Another thing with viruses, you may see deformed wing viruses on the bees, but many viruses are invisible in the field. Multiple deadouts in one yard with no clear starvation and moisture pattern can be an indicator of viruses as well. So if you do sample dead bees for viruses, make sure you freeze that sample right away. Don't store it in ethanol. Just put it in a jar or a Ziploc bag and throw it in the freezer as soon as you can to preserve the viruses. So here you can see it's quite fuzzy, but you can see deformed wing here. Down in the corner, she also has some shriveled wings, and there's some varroa mites on the bottom board. Here is an example on the left of, this is sugar syrup, actually. It kind of drained through to the bottom, which could have also potentially caused death, but there is a ton of mites on the bottom board as well. And then on the right side here, you can see quite a few mites on the bees on the bottom boards. And yeah, these can be collected for amitraz resistance if that's something you're interested in wanting to still use an Apivar product, or Amiflex is now registered. Okay, I also wanted to provide these QR codes for you guys. So these are recent papers done on virus retention in wax. So these papers kind of reiterate the importance of culling old frames. So I'll give you a second here to scan those QR codes, and we can always come back to this slide if you were unable to get it. All right, now I'm going to move over to sampling Varroa in the brood. So not the bottom board or the cluster. What you're going to do is you're going to look for those mites under dead capped brood. This is where my toothpick and my flashlight really come in handy. And keeping in mind, your spring and summer controls matter to keep your fall levels under the threshold. Other symptoms you might see in the hive is parasitic mite syndrome symptoms, and they can look very similar to European phallobrood or chilled brood. So laboratory analysis to eliminate EFB is really good of those dead larvae. And then your treatment decisions should always follow monitoring data and label directions. So you can see in the top picture here, a dead mite under the capping, or sorry, dead larva with some mites under the capping. And then the bottom one, again, is more parasitic mite syndrome. This colony recently died, but you can really see this larva that's kind of melted and pooled. It's looking a lot like EFB, but it was due to high mites. Here's a really cool photo. It's absolutely gross, but I think it's pretty cool. You can really see the different stages of Varroa in those cap cells. So you can see kind of the nymphs, some mated here, and yeah, pretty gross, but that's why a flashlight's handy. And I know I've probably said flashlight numerous times, but it is one of my good tools in the field to really get a good indication of what's going on in those cells. All right, here's a larva that I picked out. It's quite old. It's almost a scale. and you can see some dead mites on it. Lots of perforations. Yeah, don't be afraid to pick and pull stuff out and see if you can find mites. Okay, now we'll move to clinical AFB. So there's some big red flags with AFB, American foul brood, and that's spotty brood pattern, sunken punctured cappings. The scale after it dies and it turns hard, it gets really stuck on the lower cell wall. So you can kind of see in this picture, here's a scale there. I have some more photos that show it clearly as well. And the infection can be confirmed by lab testing of infected larvae or swabbing of the comb. If you don't even see larva or scale, you can still swab that comb, send it off for analysis for AFB. You really want to treat these dead outs as high risk and do not reuse the comb. Even if you don't get your sample results back quickly, if you see anything like this, just destroy it immediately and ensure it doesn't get in any contact with any of your other colonies or equipment. Here's some more really nasty photos. I can smell it. If you've ever seen an AFB infection once, generally you're gonna know exactly what you're looking for because it is quite different and the smell is pungent. I know some people can't smell it, but just even the goopiness coming out, the perforations, the sunken cells, it's very different from other pathogens. Okay, clinical EFB. So, EFB is typically linked to stress and poor nutrition early in the season, but after a few years ago, we started to see it become more virulent and it's persisting. Infections can persist into the summer, fall, and even kill colonies over winter. And what happens is the larva often dies in the coiled stage. It turns from yellow to brown, it becomes molten, and then it turns into a scale at the bottom of the cell. This scale is easy to remove. And sometimes it can look like parasitic mite syndrome, as I mentioned earlier. So you do want to send samples for analysis. And then if it does come back positive, treat it like AFB, just burn these frames. Yeah, you can see in the bottom of the cell here, there's different stages of the larva turning into scale. Okay, we got more photos here, more EFB with some dead bees. This one's a little fuzzy, but you can see on the darker comb, this is kind of more fresh infected larvae. This one here is more scale advanced in the bottom. And again, I have some more photos. This is really decomposed old EFB. And then in here, you can also see more scale. And it can be really hard to detect without a flashlight or even a magnifying glass as well, and getting your toothpick and pulling it out. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about feed. This is not my area of expertise, but I do have some webinars here in the QR code from Dr. Rob Curry in Manitoba. So they have had some like hands-on experience of bee death due to bad feed. And he goes very in depth in this first one here, lessons learned, the importance of quality feed for honeybees. So yeah, please listen to this. It's going to go into more depth on feed and what, like how colonies die from it, etc. And then there's also this other webinar he put on preparing your bees for winter. So I think this could be really useful as well. And I can always come back to this slide too. Okay, so poor feed can cause disease-like symptoms. You're going to see potentially the bees are weak. There's going to be dysentery-like symptoms, so kind of like nosema, feces on the outside. But one thing different with poor feed is The consistency of the fecal matter is going to be a little bit more sticky and gooey versus kind of dry where it's kind of like chalk where you can pick it off or scrape it off. There's also going to be a sudden die off. So that's similar to viral kill, pesticide kill, stuff like that. Yeah, so the feed is going to be part of your dead out evidence. So you want to think back, where was the source of my feed? What type of feed was it? And again, sucrose is the best option, just white sugar, refined sugar. It's the most pure. Was the source you purchased the sugar syrup from trustworthy? So the source could potentially have old feed that's mixed. It was stored improperly. It could have high moisture content. Did you get a big bulk order for cheap? Sometimes inexpensive isn't better. So if you do, oh, I'll talk about that point after, but for storage, the longer the syrup is stored, the lower the quality gets. So the quality declines. Also, the handling of the syrup. So, are you applying heat and acid to make inverted sucrose? This can be very toxic to honeybees. So if you have old syrup, say from spring, you made a big batch, you didn't use it all, don't feed that old syrup to your winter bees. But what you can do, if you must, is you can feed it to your next spring bees, but make sure you dilute it a lot with fresh syrup. Or honestly, just get rid of it, start from scratch. So inverted sucrose occurs by applying acid and high heat to it, or inverted sugar syrup. And this can generate hydroxymethylfurfural, HMF, and that compound is very toxic to bees. HMF can then further degrade to formic acid, lactic acid, and acetic acid, which is also really toxic to your bees. So if you suspect something's going on with your syrup, do some rigorous testing, send it off for analysis, especially if it's for your winter feed. So one thing different about winter bees versus spring bees is they're not as good at buffering syrup acidity and adjusting the pH to the appropriate level. And just keeping in mind with your testing, HMF measure amounts, what you get back from the lab alone is not a good indicator of off-spec syrup because it degrades. So you want to also get your syrup tested for the pH, for the acidity. And then titration. So you want to get it measured. So the amount of acid that's in the sugar syrup would be the titration. Here is just a bit of a comparison to bad off-spec syrup versus on-spec syrup. So bad, it's going to be a bit dark, yellowish. Dr. Rob Curry says kind of like urine. It may cause heavy dysentery. There's a high HMF level and low pH, so it's very acidic. And then your titration levels, concentrations are high. On spec, it's going to be nice and clear. Your bees are healthy, no visual digestive issues. If you're sending for analysis, you're going to have a low HMF level and your pH will be around 3 to 4. All right, so sample submissions. Where are you going to send your samples to? Well, first and foremost, I would say contact us at our email b@gov.ab.ca, and we can come out and do a winter loss inspection. We can take samples, get them analyzed for you, kind of look at the bigger picture. If you want to take your own samples, you can send them to the National Bee Diagnostic Center at the first QR code, and they can then analyze dead bees for viruses, nosema, EFB, AFB larvae. You can also get your queen health checked out. Also sending your varroa mites for amitraz resistance. They do, and much more. They do a ton of laboratory analysis. Also, for sugar syrup, you can send to our GOA Agri-Food Assurance lab. So they can test the HMF and pH, but not the titration. And this QR code is actually, they don't really have a website. So I went on the Alberta Beekeepers Commission website, and this is a QR code to the sample submission forms and where to email those forms and your samples and mail your samples. And so you can send honey samples, pesticide kill samples, as well as sugar syrup samples to this lab. Okay. So, once you have compiled all your observations, your documentation, your sample analysis results, you're going to then interpret what all of that means. And you're going to take in consideration your previous fall management practices. So, what chemical treatments were done? What were your pathogen infestation levels when monitoring? What feed was fed to your colonies? You're going to review everything and try to determine the cause of death. Um, Again, most of the dead outs I've seen in the last like 5 years have been directly related to Varroa mite kill and viruses, but there could be multiple factors. And again, you may not be able to determine a cause. So sometimes you're just scratching your head and you're like, why did this hive die? But can I reuse the comb? That's the biggest question. Am I going to infect a new healthy colony? So yeah, going through this process is really helpful for the following year or following colonies. So yeah, your final steps, you're going to act. You're going to keep monitoring and controlling Varroa early and often. Do your best with what treatments are registered. You're going to treat based on threshold and labels. Confirm adequate and quality food stores. And then avoid late season starvation surprises. So get out as early as you can with pollen patties, things like that. And then ensure your queen quality is good going into the fall and requeen proactively when needed. And most importantly is culling old comb routinely, especially after a high winter kill. Pathogens, residues accumulate in that wax. It just kind of sticks right in there and then it can reinfect colonies. And don't worry, you got this. Thank you guys so much. Here's my email and phone number, and please let me know if you have any questions at all.
Thank you, Ali. That was really informative.
Awesome.
I didn't know that about winter feed being a
Yeah.
concern.
Yeah, so that webinar, Dr. Rob Curry goes very in depth on feed and how the winter bees are quite different from spring bees.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet, if anyone wants to add some. I have a question for you, Ali.
Ooh.
If you go to a yard and the whole yard is dead,
Yeah.
and you're not seeing signs of pesticide poisoning, you've
Mhm.
observed from the outside of the colony, what would you recommend? Because that's a lot of colonies and it's
Yes.
a little overwhelming.
Yes, agreed. Recently I just had an inspection like this and there was no brood in the hive. There was a lot of honey stores still in there. All of the bees were dead in a large apiary. So I took all the debris samples I could and I took quite a few and I'm getting those tested for viruses. So deformed wing, VDV, chronic bee paralysis virus. And then also I'm sending some frames away and getting them swabbed for viruses. I'm not sure what those results are going to look like because that's something new that I started doing. But yeah, I'm just taking as many samples as I can and getting them analyzed. It was likely viruses, but
Okay.
again, it's the process of elimination. You want to look at those frames inside the deadouts, make sure there's no foul brood scale, things like that. I
Awesome.
hope that
Okay. Thank you.
answered. Yeah.
It does. We have a question in the chat. So, when culling old frames, is scraping the wax enough, or should the frame be discarded and replaced with a new frame?
It's a very good question, and I think it really depends on what you're working with here. If it's American foul brood or European foul brood, I would just get rid of the whole frame completely, start with a fresh one. If it's like nosema you're working with, you could potentially scrape it. Viruses, I'm not sure you'd want to scrape the wax. You'd have to make sure all of the wax is off essentially. But yeah, so it kind of depends. Is it a high risk pathogen or a low risk pathogen?
That makes sense.
Good question, though. I get that one a lot.
All right. I'll give it a second for any other questions. But if not, then we'll wrap it up.
All right, this was quite short. Well, I hope people learned something from it. Oh, Karen, I see. Do you have to get rid of the boxes if you have EFV? So, no. So, what you can do, if the boxes are in good shape, you can scrape any of the wax that's in there or on the edges and propolis. Oh, I'm just gonna move that. And then you can use a tiger torch or a propane torch and just kind of scorch the inside of the box just to make sure any bacteria has been burnt.
And there's a question on the cost of testing.
Yeah, so if you want to send samples yourself, there will be a cost. And that QR code, the NBDC one, which I can go back right here, they will have all that information and a contact info to tell you the cost. If we take the samples, we will send those samples off. Keep in mind that our program is pretty small, like there's 4 inspectors, so we can't get out to every winter loss, but sometimes we can work with you over the phone or with photos to determine the cause.
Great. And I think we have a bit of an off-topic question.
Yeah,
I think it's your job as PA now.
yeah.
Um, Asking about getting information on the new rules for use of oxalic and glycerin pads.
Yeah, so you're gonna follow the label on PMRA. That's pretty like we can also we're actually going to send an email, a PA update to all registered beekeepers. I just remembered on the new registered miticides this year. So there's been Apivar 2.0, Amaflex, and oxalic acid glycerin pads. So we'll send an email with those links, and then you can take a look and follow the label.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Allie, and thank
Yeah,
you for everyone who attended. I hope you
awesome.
learned a lot about dead out inspections and how to use that when you're checking your dead outs this spring.
Yeah, awesome. Take care, everyone.